of the plaster gauze?
Oh yeah, you want to send that to the Google Classroom, the link, you know, for the classwork assignment, so you can get credit for it. All right. I got my apron on. All right, so let's see. Should I turn the light on? Is it too dark? Maybe I need to set you guys on something higher up and then I set it down. So I need to find something that I can put you guys on top of so you can see better. Maybe this toilet roll of paper towels might work. That works, I think. Is that good? I'm gonna set you over here. That's better, I think. You can see? I'm gonna go over here. Is that too far away? Is that better? I'm so pro at this recording thing, right? That works, right? Okay.
Sure.
All right, so I'm gonna put this aside. I've got my mold here. Oh, I gotta get my control jelly. You don't have to record all of this part, Chris. I mean, like, can you stop record too if you need to? All right. So this is a waste mold. So what's going to happen is after you crack your piece out, it's basically a waste mold. They call it a waste mold, and so it's trashed. So I basically can trash this. If you're lucky enough, you can pull out your mold without trashing it, but a lot of times you end up trashing it. So that's your final product over there. So when you make plaster, you want a flexible bucket, okay? Never use anything don't use anything like glass or, stuff like that, because you need something flexible that you can kind of crack the plaster out. You guys, do not drive your parents crazy. Do not drop any of this plaster inside your sink, because if it hardens in your sink's going to be clogged and your parents are going to yell at you like crazy, because basically you've messed up their sink and now they need to get a plumber out to fix their sink. So even this is a little bit deep. I prefer a more shallower bowl, but you can basically roll. If it's a plaster bucket, you can kind of roll the plaster out and basically get the plaster. I have a big giant chunk that I don't need here. And if it was more of a better bucket, I can pull this out easier. But you want to basically let your plaster dry and let it harden, and then pull the plaster out once it's completely dry. And then you get a nice as clean as it can be, because I picked up a pretty trashy bucket. This is a yogurt container. So use anything that is flexible, that can bend like this, and it's something that you don't want to really keep, because don't use anything nice, because you might crack it while you're trying to empty out the thing. And so it comes out pretty smoothly, and a lot of times my students really like to keep these, and what they'll do is like carve into them and like do little carvings and stuff. So you could do that, and but never ever use glass or steel or metal or anything like that, because you're never going to get the plaster out. You're basically just going to you're going to end up trashing the container. And a lot of times when I ask my students to clean up, those of the people who use the buckets, I tell them not to clean the bucket, because you want the plaster to dry so that you can just crack the bucket out. So a lot of times the students that are casting are the ones who actually clean out the buckets, not the people that use the bucket. So everybody cleans it out, but you got to clean out your own bucket, because it's better to wait. So don't take your wet plaster and try to clean out your bucket, because it's safer to allow the you want to refrain from clogging up your sink as much as possible. Also, as you can see, all this white stuff. Make sure that you lay out maybe a garbage bag or some butcher paper or something to cover up the table, so you don't have to do so much cleanup too, okay? And I mean, it comes off, but if you're on a hard table and you're trying to scrape, you're gonna have a hard time scraping everything. I mean, it comes off, but it's just easier cleanup. You don't wanna make a mess mess if you can, and then have your parents all pissed off at you, okay? So that's rule number one, never use a metal or a glass container, always some kind of plastic container. And see how it's so easy to clean up. You just have to make sure that it's flexible, all right? So what you want to do is you need your either release agent. I'm using some CeraVe baby healing ointment I use on my hands and lips all the time. It has to be petroleum based. You can't use lotion. So just like when you were doing the release for your for you're putting the mold on, you need to put a release on the inside. And this is where you don't want to get too crazy with your release. You want to make sure that you have a nice layer, but without being like, let me turn on the light. I don't know if you can see very well. Oh, see what I'm doing on the inside of the mold. Is that better? Maybe. If I can, I live in the dark. And so, you know, I'm like Yvonne, I like to be living in shadow. So you don't want to put large like clumps in there, because actually what you put on the inside is going to be what is shown when you actually cast the object. And so you want to get a nice layer in there. So I like to kind of rub it in. Try not to be too aggressive. And then if you get like little, what I like to do is have a little paper towel, which you guys are sitting on my paper towel roll. So, and I kind of wipe my hand as I'm working, because you get the little crumblies in there. And you can also use a brush if you have got a brush that's kind of crappy, and you want to get every little bit. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to squeeze out quite a bit. So I don't feel like. And you want to get it all. Is that an ice cream truck? It's weird. I just think ice cream truck music is creepy. I just think of like weird pedophiles and ice cream trucks. Why are they playing Christmas music in an ice cream truck when it's not, when it's the summertime? And what I also like to do is get around the edge a little bit over here, because it will help you when you have to release. And so what I do is I just kind of put along the edge to kind of help with the releasing. Because sometimes when you're pouring, the plaster will go over the edge, and it will, you know, stick to the edge. And so it really helps to kind of lay it onto the edge. So I'm using the same materials as you guys did. I was a little worried because the plaster is slightly contaminated, so the setting time is going to be different than when you're watching stuff on YouTube and everything. It's going to feel a little bit differently, but I got it to work, and it's rock hard, and so the plaster completely did set. And so what I do sometimes, I'll take a towel, or you can take a napkin and just kind of, you know, even if you do this, you can see kind of the scrape marks. I've just kind of removed some of the excess off. You want a nice coating. So now, but you guys, when you do this, don't do this and then wait till tomorrow to cast. I would cast right away, because if you leave this till the next day, what's going to happen is that, I mean, it could work. That means that you're going to have to put a thicker coating, but I've had students where they'll put the petroleum jelly on, and then they'll wait 2 or 3 days, and it's completely absorbed and embedded into the plaster mold. And so what happens is that, you know, their piece gets stuck in the mold because the petroleum jelly has absorbed. Okay, so you want a nice sheen. Make sure everything is covered so that nothing gets stuck in there, but you also don't want lumps. And so I'm making sure that I don't have any lumps in here, so that doesn't show when you're casting the item. You can also, like, if you have crevices like that, you could take a fine brush. I wouldn't use anything nice, because the brushes get ruined because you're putting petroleum jelly on the brushes. That's like a resist. And so if you're painting, you don't want, if you have your good painting brush, you don't want to use that for something like this. Then you have to use soap and water and make sure you really rinse it out well because of the oils that are in the petroleum jelly. So you get like that. So after that, Actually, I'm going to carry you guys my plaster powder. So what you into the sink. So tell me if you can't see something, because a lot of times I'm kind of looking to this is so complicated. I'm trying to look at the camera and then making sure that you guys are seeing what I'm doing. Put you guys in a bucket. So, and hopefully I don't drop the computer into the sink. Okay. Now where's my, okay. So what you want to use is cold water, but I don't think it matters that much right now. Normally you want to use cold water because you want as much setting time as possible. But since this plaster is kind of not so good, you can use warmer water. So it's not going to set. Heat is what heat and agitation is what starts the chemical reaction for the plaster. And so if you use heat, it's going to set faster. If you use cold water, it's going to set slower. And a lot of times, people like to use cold because they want more working time. All right. So the ratio for plaster is 1 to 1. All right. So basically, if I put this much water, right now it's about right here. If I use this much water, the plaster is going to go up to there. So don't be weird and put water up to here, because when you start putting plaster inside, you're going to go overflow. So Archimedes' law, you don't, you want to make sure that it's a 1 to 1. So 1 part water and 1 part plaster, that if you want to fill up this yogurt cup, it needs to be over here. The water needs to be halfway so that you can fill it up to the top. If you fill it up even 2/3 away with water, you're still going to have overflow. So, it's 1 to 1, always 1 to 1. Okay. So right now I've had the water filled up to a little bit less than half because I like a little bit of extra room up top to play around with. Also think about the size of your mold. If I have a pretty small mold, so I don't need that much plaster. So this much plaster is going to be plenty to fill up the whole mold of the hand. All right. Any questions so far? All right. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to transfer you guys over to where the plaster is. So you guys are moving with me. And set you guys up in a box. I think you can see that. All right, and so what I'm gonna do is, if you want, it gets a little dusty, you can wear a dust mask if you want. And this is pretty crunchy stuff. And I'm gonna see if you guys can see inside of the bucket that I'm using, so it's bright enough. And what you wanna do is sprinkle. And normally, if this plaster wasn't so crappy, you would have better sprinkling going on here. But you wanna sprinkle, if you have good plaster that's like sets quickly, much quicker, you would sprinkle kind of rigorously. You don't want to dump. Dumping is bad. So you want to sprinkle rigorously. You're going to have a lot of dust. Try not to breathe it, but it's not going to kill you. And you want to add the plaster until you see an island. Okay. Let me show you what the island looks like. Can you see the island? Okay. You cannot see the island. You guys see the island? All right. Can you see it?
Kind of.
Kind of? Good. All right, let me try a different angle. Near the light. Can you see the island?
Yes, I can see.
Okay.
It.
So it's an island, like it's a peaking above the water, and the thing is, if you use a wider and more shallow container, you want to make sure that you can kind of see the island and then it's peaking up. So if you're like, I've had students where they don't add enough plaster because they're just dumping it into one spot. You want to sprinkle it through the whole thing, and then once you start seeing a little island is when there's enough. Okay. And a lot of times, a lot of artists a lot of sculptors who say to make it, my friend who teaches sculpture at Seton Hill University, she says, oh, it's honey. She calls it honey. And I call it more like, buttermilk and pancake. And so it's kind of like cooking. So once you really don't want to wait as long as I did, but if you have really good consistency plaster. But since I've got crappy plaster, that's why I'm kind of taking so long to work this out. So I've noticed that it's a little okay to go a little bit thicker since we're doing open face mold, okay? So this is more like a pancake mix. Ooh. See that? It's like pancakes. And you guys, since you're doing an open face mold, you can go pancake. So your pancake mixtures, if you were to dip your hand, you can kind of coat the whole hand. If you're doing a closed face, I love the smell of plaster. If you're doing a closed face mold, you want to go more with honey. So you need something a little thinner than this. But none of you guys are actually doing a closed face, closed mold. So most of you guys just have like an open face mold. So we can go a little bit thicker so that it'll dry faster. And so what I like to do is start tapping inside of the mold. And so I'm going to put a little bit in and I'm going to start tapping. And the reason why I kind of rub it in here like this, and the reason why I do this is why you want something underneath of you is because, and I roll the mold around. And the reason why I do this is because you don't want air bubbles. Okay. The air bubbles, remember like when you were doing your mold, your first layer is always the most important. So you want to make sure that I actually made this plaster a little bit too thick, but it's okay. You want to make sure that that first layer is coated all the way in here. So I make sure that everything's coated, and I have and it's a tapping motion, and you don't want to be like rubbing it. You're not rubbing the mold. You're just kind of tapping it and filling up any area. And see that air bubble in there? You want to get rid of it? You can blow into it if you need to, if you can't reach it. And basically covering and rolling the mold to make sure that every area is completely coated in the plaster. And at this state, you'll notice that the plaster is getting a little bit on the thicker side. See now it's a little bit, it changes. And so what I want to do is eventually completely layer this, but it's still, I can go, since I have a nice layer now on the inside, see that? It's like your little crust. You can go in and kind of keep on rolling. And I sometimes scrape my hand along the side because you actually want your edges to be thicker. Because if you don't pay attention to your edges, see how like I kind of scrape along the side and make a wall? It really helps to keep the edges a little bit thicker, because if you don't make your edges thicker, it has a more of a chance to crack along the edge. And so I don't neglect my edges, like, all of you guys with your hair and your hairline, you don't neglect your edges. You guys pay attention to your edges. So I'm waiting, and you'll notice that also it starts to get a little bit warmer. Unfortunately, this plaster isn't that good. And so it's setting up very slowly and it's not getting as warm. So you want to give yourself a good like 20 minutes to play around with this. If you start and you got to go somewhere in 30 minutes, then give yourself like a good hour for setup and everything like that. And so what I'm doing is actually I'm waiting for this plaster to thicken up. See how it started to thicken more? So it's not as, it doesn't flow as well. That's when you want to start like adding it in. And still I can wait probably a little bit for it to be a little bit on the thicker side. And I start dipping in it. And you don't want it to be middle heavy, you guys. So you don't want it to be just like heavy right in the middle and then thin edges, which I've seen a lot of students do, or they'll try to fill in the whole thing. If you fill in the whole thing, you can technically do that, but you're really wasting a lot of plaster. And then on top of that, your piece is going to be so heavy because it's basically solid plaster. So I like to try to, everything wants, of course, with gravity, wants to move to the center. So what I'll do is I'll move it off to the side, scrape along there, make sure that, and that's why you wanted your mold a little bit on the thicker gauze side, because you're, kind of moving your hand around it, messing with the edge. And I'm kind of just, and since that was a high point, I want to make sure that when the plaster gets a little bit thicker, I am paying more attention to that little spot. This is, this is easier. The reason why I wanted you guys to do open face mold, because it's a little easier to mess around with, especially with messed up plaster. If, now I see how it starts to get thick, it doesn't even flow anymore. It kind of Okay. And so this is a good time to do all your like, you know, putting it in, re-securing it. And plaster is kind of this, you know, we work in stages. And since you guys are lucky that the plaster is actually kind of messed up because you have more time to work with it. A lot of times it dries so quickly. I've had students where they'll mix their plaster and they'll come to the table and then they're like, it's hard already. And that's because the plaster was quick setting. And so there's a lot of like different quick setting plaster, you know, and some slower setting. And plaster Paris normally sets a little slower, but this is a lot slower because normally I would be done by now. So. And I know that's a high point. So you see how making sure that there's enough plaster in that little high point so that I don't have a hole or a crack in the areas. And the inside doesn't have to look good. It just needs to be thick enough and even. And I like to make sure that the plaster is even all the way through my mold. And so while now it starts getting, see how thick it is now? It's not even dripping. And this has been about 10, 15 minutes. And this is a good time to just kind of make sure that all your areas are evenly thick and you have enough plaster all the way around. And that, it doesn't seem like a lot of plaster that's missing if you were to just pour it solid in there, but it does make a difference in the weight. And then as the plaster dries and the water evaporates from your plaster, it'll get harder and it'll get lighter and lighter because of the fact that it's removing moisture from the plaster. Okay, and then what I like to do is I like to hold onto it until it's dry enough that when I do something like this, plaster's not going to fall or move around that much. And I'll shake it around. What you can do is you can tap it if there's any air bubbles, if you're worried about any air bubbles. So, but the reason why, remember I told you to petroleum jelly the edges, because you get plaster on the edges. And so you want to try to, when you're trying to pull the mold away from your piece, sometimes it gets stuck on those edges. And so that's why the petroleum jelly on the edges. So this is not going to go that way anywhere. It's still soft to the touch, it still moves around, but this is not going to move anywhere. So I can actually set this down and let it dry. Okay. And if in normal case situation, I would tell you to wait till the plaster dries off your hand and crack it off. But this plaster dries so slow that you also don't want to, if you have this much plaster on your hands, I really suggest not to just go to your sink and just empty it. Take a paper towel and wipe your hands off before you go to the sink. And because you want to avoid, it's not going to clog your sink if you just have like a residue like that. But if you are doing a lot of plaster at home, you want to just make sure that you're removing as much excess off your hand and stuff before you start washing your hands at the sink. And that's what I like to do to avoid. I had a student, actually you guys know Eric Mack because you guys went to the Brooklyn Museum to see his work. He clogged up my sink for 5 years because he didn't listen to me. And he poured wet plaster down my sink. It dried and then basically clogged my sink completely, one of them. And then on top of that, because the school system is so slow at fixing stuff. Even though I put in an order to fix my sink, they didn't come in until 5 years later. So literally my sink was clogged for 5 years. And it's terrible, you guys. So please don't do that to yourself and drive your parents crazy. Anyway, I don't want to get in trouble for your mistakes. So. I mean, normally, if the plastic cured properly, you can probably just wait till it completely dries and it flakes off your hand, but this stuff does not flake off your hand right away. You'd have to sit there for another 20 minutes for it to flake off your hand. So like I said, just take a paper towel or napkin and just wipe off as much as you can before you wash your hands under the sink, okay? And moisturize because this stuff makes it completely dry. And then, so as you can see, is starting to already harden, and your piece of, for some reason, this plaster doesn't really do it, but sometimes when you have really good plaster, you can actually feel the heat and the chemical reaction, and it feels warm to the touch. Unfortunately, this is not. All right, so see, this is already kind of firm, but of course it's still soft, so I can put a fingerprint on there. So you're gonna just let this sit for probably a good, I don't know, a couple hours, an hour, and then you'll see that when it gets hard to the touch where you can't put any fingerprints on it, and it's hard, you can pull it out, okay? All right, I think I'm done. And so, Chris, you want to turn off the recording and then I'll answer questions.
Miss Hong, what do you mean by pulling it off?
We're gonna have to pull the mold off of your piece, and that's where you get the final piece. So the mold gets thrown away, and then you end up with what's called the casting, which is what I just showed you. I'm showing you how to cast your mold.
So the mold is the thing we did.
Yeah, it's the shell. It's the shell. It's like the taco shell. We're putting the filling in there, and so the filling is called the casting.
Oh.
And so the filling makes an impression of the inside of the mold. And so what happens is when you pull the mold off, when you peel it off, you end up getting the positive of the negative. So it's kind of like in photography, the mold is the negative and the casting is the positive.
Okay, but would the mold break like if you try to take it off?
Yeah, so the mold is a waste mold. So what they call in the sculpture, when you only use a one-time mold, you end up peeling the mold off. You see this? I peeled that mold off of this. And this is called, this was on top of here like this, and I basically peeled it off. And I'll give a demo how to peel it off safely. And I peeled it off. And then, so this is the positive that I got from the mold that we made.
So once you peeled it off, like you just started filling in the inside.
No, you've already filled in the inside. See,
that
from
one you
from
showed.
the,
Oh, so this is a different one.
yeah, I made a separate mold so I can give the demo. This was my tester to see if the plaster was okay. And so I made another mold so that I can give you the demo of how to pour. And so you guys will have a face one. Yours will be a face, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so you're gonna pour in the plaster the same way like this. And then once we're done, the last step will be not last step, but you guys will then, your next step after you pour this will be your peeling off. And I'll demo how to peel off carefully. I've had students pull off noses and stuff like that. So I'll show you how to pull off your mold without ruining your piece.
Another class, though, right?
Yeah, another class.
Okay.
Because we have to wait for this to dry. And so I just want to get you through this. And already it's pretty hard, but it's still kind of, see how I'm pressing into it, less fingerprints. So it's setting up. It's just taking a while to set up. And normally if this was like really good plaster, it would be done already. We would be able to peel right now. But I don't want to take any chances. And I'm just going to wait till the next day, which that's the same thing I did for this. I waited till the next day to peel that off. You want to be patient when it comes to casting. You can't really rush the process. You have to just kind of work with the process. And if you want to dry faster, you can put it out in the sunlight. You can put it in over a heater. It's basically, we need to get the moisture to evaporate. And this is still heavy. There's a lot of moisture in this. If it's cold to the touch, if there's still moisture in there. When it starts feeling warm or like body temperature to the touch, you know that a lot of the plaster is evaporated and it becomes lighter. And so water is the main weight that's in your plaster. The powder isn't very heavy at all. And so once the water completely evaporates from this piece, it's going to be probably pretty light. And then I'm going to show you guys how to clean it. And so this is what you call flashing. Once we pull it out, this edge here, like this kind of stuff that sticks out, that's called flashing. And if I were to do a 2-part mold, you would still have the flashing on there. And so if I did a mold where it was like connected together and it was solid and I had to pour through a hole, which, and you would, it's a little bit more complicated. And that's why I asked you guys all to make an open face mold, because you have to roll it around. I'm not really confident about this plaster to do a closed face mold. And I probably test it out, you know, to see if I can do a closed face mold without damaging the casting. So I'm going to probably do another tester. If any of you guys are interested who come to school or doing, you know, I can show you guys how to do alginate mold really easily. I mean, it takes like one class period and you can basically cast a perfect hand, a perfect foot. This is the hard way to do it. And if anybody is like, if you want a hand that looks like this or making different movements and stuff like that, or delicate pieces, you actually alginate is the best way to go. And that's how, if you go to Mica, that's how they show you how to cast. They use alginate, they use the same product. This is the old classic way I'm showing you. So if you know how to do this, you're gonna be fine. Like if you know how to use plaster, if you know how to make a plaster mold, it's probably, that's like the old school way. It's like learning you know, darkroom photography as opposed to learning how to point and shoot with the digital camera. So it's kind of the old school way, the harder way. And so a lot of students who know how to plaster cast actually are pretty good, end up being pretty good at other types of casting. And but the hard part would be like a closed face mold. So if I did like one section of my arm and then I did the other section, put it together and then poured the plaster into it, that would be a closed mold where I would have to make sure that the plaster is that right consistency so I can roll the plaster into the mold. So basically if this was solid, I would roll it around until it filled it up and it looked like, you know, hollow, but a good thick layer on the inside. You roll it. And you could do that with something called, you know, a lot of times people make a plaster mold, but then they create something called a slip. And the slip is like a clay watery mix. And what they do is they use a slip and they, you know, people, that's actually how they make a lot of clay sculptures too. They don't really model it. A lot of times they make it out of like oil-based clay. They make a casting of it and then they'll use a clay slip and they roll it into the plaster mold and then the clay pops out and there you go, you have the ceramic piece, you know. So there are ways to create ceramic sculptures without going from bottom up. You know, you can basically use something like plasticine, which is really forgiving, and then you make a casting of it in, you make a mold of it in like a plaster and then slip cast it. I'll show you in screen share. So, you know, once if you know how to make a plaster mold, you can actually fill it up with many, many different things. You can fill it up with wax, you can fill it up with chocolate. And if any of you guys want to play around with, you know, soap, or if you want a clear casting, let's say you make a face, but you want it to look clear, you can probably cast it in like glycerin soap or wax, and you would have this kind of clear look to it. It's kind of cool. Let me share something real quick. So when I talked about slip casting, see, it's like you know, you're creating a plaster mold. You see that? And so this is how to make duplicates over and over again. You make these two pieces, you put it together, and you take like a liquid version of, like a watery version of clay, and then you roll it inside the mold, and you can make multiples over and over and over again. So this is like a slip casting. So it is pumpkin that you can constantly make over and over and over again in ceramic. And as you can see from something like this, this is the pumpkin. There's always a place where you can pour the clay. And then a lot of times there's another little vent that goes out at the bottom, and it's called a vent because you need a place for the air to escape. And sometimes they do that. They make teacups like that. There's molds. And so there's nobody on that wheel making each cup over and over and over again, unless you get a handmade cup. But a lot of times, a lot of these ceramic things are made from molds and then slip cast so that it's made over and over and over and over again so that you can have a set of teacups that look the same. And these are, you know, nowadays, I don't know if they still use plaster, but I think they may use fancier stuff. But in the classic way was always a plaster slip cast to re-mimic a cup or to redo a mold of the same thing over, like you're doing something over and over and over again. And a lot of these molds can be very, very elaborate, when you're working with stuff. And then there's something called, if you decide to go to if you decide to go to college and for art, there's a lot. Mold making is like a whole thing. And so you'll learn stuff like when you go to college, ceramic shell. So ceramic shell is basically creating, not that, this is so stupid, ceramic shell mold. And so you could be creating something called a ceramic shell that looks like this. So basically, this is a flue. This is the flue network. This is the piece itself. This is the actual sculpture that they're going to be creating. And these are little networks that go in, so that when the bronze gets poured into this whole thing is actually ceramic. It's a ceramic coating on the piece. And the piece is actually made out of wax. And so what happens is you put this in the oven and the wax melts out of this, and then you get a hollow thing called a ceramic shell. And once you get a hollow thing, what happens is then you pour metal into the ceramic shell, and then that's where you get the bronze pieces, you get the aluminum pieces. See these, so in bronze casting, you have these ceramic shells that are then bronze, and bronze is poured into, see that? Ceramic shell. And then metal is poured into that ceramic shell. So, I mean, it's pretty elaborate. I mean, I did like a whole casting book for my professor, and it's really like, and the ceramic shell is dipped and coated multiple times. So even in mold making and stuff, there's a lot of different varieties. There's sand casting, sand molds, there's, ceramic shell molds, and there's different types of molds that are used now. It's alginate, and depending on what you want to make it out of, whether it feels metal or whether you want to make, chocolate molds for candy and food, you would use something more like silicone because it's much better. So, and food safe, yeah, and food safe silicone. Okay, so that is it. Do you have any more questions? You good? Okay. If you forgot everything I said, Chris has a recording, I guess. And so if you need a copy of the recording, Chris, are you gonna put that on like, are you gonna put it somewhere?
I'll
Or you
have
just gonna have it on your file cloud?
I don't know. I have to check. I've never recorded anything before, so I was just like,
I think it goes into your cloud drive or it goes into your, what is it, Google Drive.
yeah. Either way, I'll have to probably email it. I can't send it to a text.
I know that with my school YouTube, I could only do 15 minutes. I don't know if it's the same for you guys. I know that my personal YouTube, I could put more than 15 minutes, but for the school YouTube, I only could do 15, and I would have to chop it up really badly so that I could fit into the 15 minutes. Because originally I was recording myself and putting some of the recordings on my school YouTube, but I was tired of editing, like just chopping it up to fit 15 minutes. I was just hoping to take my recording and just post it up. But I ended up having to chop it up, and I just got tired of it. And I was like, you guys can record me if you want, and I got nothing to hide, so I don't care. All right.
Let me see if I can put it on my YouTube.
I think you're still recording though.
Yeah. Oh, sorry. Let me stop.